Welcome to Science on Tap, Minocqua. This is the last month was our 5th anniversary, so I want to thank everyone for coming, and thanks especially to our most loyal attendants. We really appreciate everybody coming. My name is Susan Knight. I work at the University of Wisconsin Trout Lake Station, about 10 miles north of here. And our other partners in Science on Tap are Kemp Natural Resources Station, the Minocqua Public Library, the Lakeland Badger Chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and our friends here at the Minocqua Brewing Company. So thanks to everyone. And Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea, an idea from 1905, that the borders of the university are the borders of the state. So we try and take an interesting topic and get someone to elaborate on it and then give you an opportunity to ask questions rather than have a lecture and a PowerPoint. Although we do have some visual aids tonight. That's what they say in the ed business, right? Visual aids. Okay. So, and I would like to remind everyone that Science on Tap is funded in large part through a grant from the Brittingham Fund. So thanks to all those folks there. And just a reminder that you can watch us several ways. You can watch right here. We always have Minocqua Public Library is open with Mary Taylor, and you can go there. You don't get beer, but you do get root beer. And you can watch over there. We have live streaming. But we also have live streaming that you can do right from your own home. So if you are interested, you can stay home, but would much rather have you here. But if you're far away in the winter or whatever, then you can watch live. Just go on our website and click on Watch Live. And then we also archive all of our presentations, so you can see the entire presentation, or a couple of weeks later, we will have a 8 to 10 minute short available, sort of the highlights. So lots of ways that you can watch. Our next Science on Tap is next April, and we are going to have Dr. Hilary Dugan, who is our new professor down at the Center for Limnology in Madison, just started in January, and she's going to be talking about road salt and lakes. So a topic of interest, I think, to many of us up here, and what happens to all that salt that they put on the highways. But tonight, we are so fortunate to have John Bates and Terry Daulton, two of my favorite people in the world, the Northwood's finest artists and naturalists, and known to probably everyone around here. I'm going to introduce John first, and this is going to be a little longer introduction because you can't say enough about these guys. So, John Bates grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he bounced around in his college years, earning his bachelor's degree in communications and later a master's degree in environmental studies, both at UW Green Bay. He spent many years in counseling and in teaching. I'm not sure. That didn't come out exactly as I intended. Now that I read it, that's right. I'm sorry. In the early 90s, he was the park naturalist for American Legion, Northern Highland American Legion State Forest, earning a whopping $5 an hour to be the park naturalist. And anyway, he found that people were just hungry for information about the Northwoods and the natural history around this area, and this prompted him to start writing his Northwoods Almanac in the Lakeland Times, which you can still see today, or every other week. Is that right? Every other week. So, and he takes things that he's found. You can let him know that you found crossbills or you found a snowy owl or whatever, and he'll put it in his column. So anyway, John has written many books. Each one of them is a gem. So I hope you all have the whole series. My favorite is Trailside Botany, but that would be not a big surprise. Right. So, but his newest book, and I hope you're going to talk about it a little bit, I hope, is Our Living Ancestors. It's about old growth forest, and it's been 15 years in the making, and it has finally just come out. And there is a truckload of books someplace in Minocqua, broken down or somehow not in transit quite, but it was supposed to be here today. But at any rate, he can show you a copy. Okay, so here's your trivia question about John. Many of us have been on various outings with John, and he is always totally in control, the image of a guy in charge. But alas, maybe it wasn't always so. What was one of John's secret early mistakes? Okay, so 3 options here. The first one, he bought a canoe, never having paddled before. He tried it out when the river had just thawed, sat in it for about 30 seconds, flipped it over, dumped himself into the shallow and very cold water. He tried to sneak into the house and wash his clothes before Mary found out, but she caught him. Okay, that's story number 1. Number 2, John was leading a canoe trip along the Flambeau River, missed the takeout point, ended up on a stretch of the river he didn't really completely recognize. Rather than admit he was uncertain of where he was, he took the whole group down some class 3 rapids before they made it over to shore. Okay, number 3. John is a great botanist, but he wasn't always. He was leading one of his early spring hikes before everything had leafed out. One hiker found the little plant with pretty white berries and brought it over to John for identification. John did not recognize it and passed it around to see if anyone else knew what it was. The next day, when they all had itchy blisters all over their hands, they realized it had been poison ivy with last year's berries, but no new leaves. The stems and berries are still very toxic. All right, so dumping the canoe, do we have a show of hands? Or just yell out. This is not quite radio, but sort of like radio. Okay, all right, number 2, missing the takeout point. All right, we got a lot of votes for that. The last one, the poison ivy. Oh, yeah, no, it was the first one. So, and there were some details I left out. Maybe John can embellish right here. And he sold the canoe. And honestly, the other 2 I completely made up. He did not do either of those things, okay? So, all right. Terry Daulton is another local treasure. Terry grew up in the Finger Lakes region in western New York. She attended Northland College up in Ashland, getting her degree in environmental studies and art, and then a master's degree from UW Stevens Point in environmental education. She spent a bunch of years as a biological technician, a park ranger, staff biologist at Sigurd Olson Environmental Institute. She then took off around the world to return to the artistic side of her. She settled in Mercer, just up the road, and has found many ways to marry her art with her interest in natural history and environmental issues. Both Terry and John have been part of several art and science collaborations with Trout Lake Station. That's how I really got to know both of them very well, including an art and climate change collaboration called Paradise Lost. I think Terry's going to talk about that. And both were also part of a science and art collaboration with our long-term ecological research program. The acronym is LTER, and they called the art program LTE Arts. That was pretty clever, I thought. And that resulted in some extraordinary visual artwork and poetry by John all over, and it toured all over the US. It was a great program, including the National Science Foundation in Washington. Now Terry is the president, and John is an active member in a newly formed group of mostly retired scientists working to promote scientific management of Wisconsin natural resources called Wisconsin's Green Fire, Voices for Conservation. Okay, so here's your trivia question for Terry. Terry has had some amazing adventures. Which one of these really happened? Okay, 1, when she was a park ranger in the Apostle Islands, she was giving a talk about liverworts and lichens, a fascinating topic, I think, when a bear walked behind them and walked right into a trap that was set for that bear. The bear tripped the trap with a loud clang and was stuck inside, creating a distraction from Terry's talk. Okay, number 2. Once she was surf fishing with her husband, Jeff, when his fishing rod got carried off. She, being the stronger swimmer, swam after it and kept swimming even when it kept moving out to sea faster and faster. She finally caught up to it, set the hook, swam back to shore, and it turned out she had hooked a shark. Okay, story number 3. Terry once was leading an interpretive paddle on the Turtle Flambeau flowage. She got out of her boat and climbed up onto the top of a beaver lodge to talk about beaver ecology. While she's expounding, one of the other trip leaders notices that a swarm of water snakes had been basking in the lodge and was heading up to the top to see who was making such a racket. He said, Terry jumped back into her boat in record time. Sort of gave that one away. Yeah. All right. Which story was true? All right. All three. Terry and John.
Thank you, Susan. I think this is turned on, right? Yeah, everyone can hear me. Okay. Oh, I have to stay standing here, but I can move my chair back. There we go. Well, I'm really pleased to be here tonight and speak with this group. I've had the pleasure of sitting in the audience many times before and really enjoyed the venue. And so it's with great expectation that I was thinking about this talk over the last couple of weeks, and I'm happy to be here to share some of the most fun and inspiring parts of my career, which has to do with these arts and science and humanities collaborations. And I've been really lucky to work with John and Susan and the other folks at Trout Lake, and even Robert Bohannon over there from UW-Madison on some of the projects. Susan mentioned a couple of them. The Paradise Lost project that I'll talk a little bit more about in my short speech here at the beginning, and also our longer-term project, which we no longer call LTE Arts. I have to tell you, a scientist came up with that name. We call it Drawing Water, which we think is a little better. And that project has had many different elements, from traveling exhibits to wayside signage to now we've developed an annual artist in residence. And we just have selected our two artists for this season. And we're very excited. Mary Burns is going to be one of our artists, Weaver from Manitowish Waters, and better half of the John and Mary show. And the second artist is Janet Moore, and she's a watercolor artist from the Chequamegon Bay area that also has a very strong interest in natural history and environmental education. So they'll be around this summer if you get a chance to catch what they're working on at the Trout Lake Station. So, but I'm going to take a little bit off the playbook of Susan with starting my talk with a little quiz. And I'm going to ask Susan, as our unbiased recorder of data, scientist that she is, to help us remember kind of the results, because at the end of my little talk, I'm going to come back and give you the answers. So what I have is quotes by three very well-known people from the science and arts world. I have a quote from the physicist and genius Albert Einstein. I have a quote by the French Impressionist painter Claude Monet, who was so famous for painting the water lilies, hay bales, and other scenes in France with all that beautiful impressionistic light. And I have a quote from Salvador Dali, who was sort of one of these avant-garde surrealist painters. You might remember the painting of the table with the clock on it that was sort of dripping off the table. You know, so sort of a more of a modern artist. So, your challenge, I'm going to read the three quotes, and then I'm going to read them next, and we're going to let you vote on which person you think it is. So I'll read the quotes through all three of them once to give you a chance to kind of mull it over, then we'll go back for the quiz. So, quote number 1. It's on the strength of observation and reflection that one finds a way, so we must dig and delve unceasingly. Quote 2. I am like a carnivorous fish swimming between the cold water of art and the warm water of science. And quote number 3, the most beautiful things we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. So, I'll start with the first one. So, you're going to be thinking like Einstein, Monet, Dali. So, the first quote. It's on the strength of observation and reflection that one finds a way. So we must dig and delve unceasingly. So I want you to clap if you think it's Einstein. Okay? Now you're listening for volume here, Susan. So now clap if you think it's Claude Monet. Clap if you think it's Salvador Dali. Okay. You got it, Susan? Got it. Okay. So, quote number 2. I am like a carnivorous fish swimming in the cold water of art and the warm water of science. Einstein? Monet? Dali. Okay? And last but not least, the most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious, is the source of all true art and science. Einstein. Monet. Dali. Okay. Brave, brave. All right. So, at the very end of the talk, we'll come back and I'll tell you the answer, so I'm going to keep you in suspense. Just for 10 minutes, 10 minutes. But the reason I picked those out is my argument in my time here is going to be that all, whether you're a scientist, a writer, a poet, an artist, what they're all seeking are 3 things: mystery, beauty, and truth. So I'm going to kind of come back to that theme at the end. So I want to start by talking a little bit about art and science using this beautiful example right here. This is a painting that was done by Mindy Schnell as part of our Drawing Water program. And in our Drawing Water program, what we've been doing over the years is periodically developing traveling exhibitions of work that would travel around the Northwoods or to other venues outside of the Northwoods region, and we'd have scientific information that went along with that. So the artists and scientists would get together, we'd have kind of a workshop. Those were really fun. One of the things that we found out amazingly, would you think that you get a bunch of scientists and artists together, the artists would be a little intimidated? It was the exact opposite. They were fine. The scientists were terrified. They were like, "You're going to make me do art?" But they all found out they had a lot in common. So anyway, Mindy did this painting for one of our exhibits, and it's also on some of the wayside signs you might see around the Northwoods at the boat landings. But I think this painting is just a perfect example to use to illustrate how art and science can kind of work together in that pursuit of beauty, mystery, and truth. If you look at it on the outset, and I apologize to the folks a little bit farther off to the side, but it's a painting of fish underwater with a beautiful light coming down. A story about Mindy, how she gets this perspective. She lives up in the Natural Lakes area near Boulder Junction, and her husband Dave is one of these guys that builds beautiful wooden boats, and he rows on Trout Lake and does these fishing, like guides people for muskies, but he also fishes. And Mindy's also an avid angler, so she goes out fishing with him sometimes. But she also loves to be in the water, so she does spend a lot of time swimming and looking up from underneath, and she's done a lot of paintings of the view from underwater. Well, when she came to Drawing Water and went to the workshop, she did this depiction of fish and the underwater scene, and it's a beautiful, luscious scene. But it actually is also a wonderful example of a scientific chart. If you were to imagine this having the X and Y axis as a scientific chart, and on the upright side over here is the number of fish, and on this side is change over time. You can see that she starts out with a lot of walleye, a large number of walleye at this side of the chart, and as time goes on, the walleye begin to dwindle until they've disappeared. Correspondingly, another variable comes into play. Down here at the very bottom, a low number of the invasive species rainbow smelt. Boo. Just a few rainbow smelt come in, and then over time, the rainbow smelt increase in number until the walleye has been displaced. This is just a great example to me of the art and science communicating a concept, and it's really fun. And when you think about it, people have been combining arts and sciences since the beginning of our cave years. Think of the wall paintings in caves, or the little fertility goddesses that people used to build out of clay. And as humans' scientific achievements and technology increased, our art changed, almost as a reflection, as a way for us to think about our place in the world. So, you got to the Metal Age where we learned how to, create metals and smelting. Well, then we got, bronze sculptures and other kinds of metals in our sculptures. If you go a little further through time, technology increases, you get to the Age of Enlightenment, where we're learning about the universe and gravity and forces of nature. Well, painters discovered how to paint 3D. Images were no longer flat. It changed the art world. You think about the Industrial Revolution. That changed the art world. You get to modern times. All the way along, the arts and humanities and sciences have kind of played tag, responding to each other and helping us as a society understand where we fit and how we can respond over time to changes in our environment and changes in our understanding. So I would like to make the argument that these things are very closely allied, and we've only, in the last maybe 100 years, come to think of them as separate. I also think about why there are certain points in history where the arts and sciences made a huge leap. For example, during the Enlightenment, or during the time when the Renaissance, the Impressionist painters. And I think about in our lifetime, has there been a point where the arts and sciences have made a huge leap? And looking around the room here, we're probably a lot of you are about the same age as I am. If I think about a time when there was a lot of change, I think back to the 1960s, when there was a lot of change in the arts and also in the sciences. You think about the Apollo moon landing, what a huge thing that was for us. And the first images as seen from space of the Earth, that fragile little globe we saw from space for the first time, isolated and vulnerable. And then there was this great, when I was researching last week, I was looking online, there was one issue of Time magazine that came out in 1968. And in the summer of that year, there was one issue that had the Apollo moon landing. It had the assassination of Martin Luther King, and it had the Cuyahoga River on fire. So imagine how many people were looking at that magazine for whatever reason, and there was that shot of the Cuyahoga River. At the same time, Rachel Carson was there with her shortly around that time period, she had published Silent Spring about the importance and problems of pollution and chemicals. These things all came together. And then you think about, well, what other parts of the arts? Well, there's music also that came into play at that time period. I'm going to just ask Noah if he could flip on just a little bit of a piece of music that I think many of you will relate to.
You don't know what you've got till it's gone. It needs paradise, put up a parking lot.
Okay, you can fade it, Noah. I'm sorry. It's really hard. The other thing I discovered about music this week is I think the reason a song makes it into a movement is it gets stuck in your head, because this song's been going through my head for days now. So, okay. So, back to the art-science collaboration. When I Googled art-science collaborations, and I got 1.4 million hits. I thought that was a lot of hits. Then I Googled science and the arts, 637 million hits. So there's a lot of art and science going on out there in the world. I looked up TED Talks, which are a communication forum, technology, entertainment, design. They started in 1984. By the year 2012, they had hit 2 billion watches. So there is a lot of this collaboration between these things going on. If you look at a particular topic, for example, climate change, I brought along my handy-dandy, another visual aid. I've got this poster left from Paradise Lost. Actually, the photo was done by Jeff Richter, who's a photographer from up in Mercer. His photographs told a lot more, he's back there in fact, about climate change and how it might feel here in the North Woods than 100 words would have done. And the Paradise Lost exhibit was actually funded in large part by Baldwin Wisconsin Idea Award, the same as this program. And it was designed to only travel for a year. Well, that exhibit was so popular, it traveled for 3 years, went all over the Midwest. We had over 100,000 people go to see that show. So if you think about climate change, we did that effort here, but at the same time, Al Gore's movie came out. I remember looking at a cover of Orion magazine that had paintings of climate change on it. There's even a science fiction genre now called cli-fi, in which the climate becomes a major character in the plot. So there's a lot of that going on, but you know, we don't see it in our everyday lives. In fact, my husband is often nagging about the fact that when we sit down to watch presidential debates over the last 10 years or so, there's hardly ever a question about science or natural resources. So what is it that stops us from really embracing all this science? Well, some people say we're just lazy. I recently picked up a book called Environmental Melancholia. It's a very depressing book by Renee Lertzman. And she makes the argument that facing things like climate change and the changes on our planet that make it an unsustainable place for us is so painful that we go into a grieving mode where we deny that it's even going on. We try to disassociate with it and ignore it. Other people will say that, well, maybe it's cognitive dissonance. Changing our lives so that we don't have to worry about climate change, or saving our lives, the whole underpinning of our society is based on fossil fuel use. And it isn't a pleasant thing to think about. So there's all sorts of reasons that we could be using. The third thing I think about is a study I heard about on public radio is how people respond to change. If you think about humans, and I heard this study, I've never read it, I didn't have the whole paper, but it really makes sense to me. The researchers found that humans respond in 3 ways. 1, you're faced with a lot of change, you want to go back to a safe place that you used to know, back to whatever it was that you had before. The second method, you want to get out ahead of the change and make it for your own advantage. And I think about Tesla and the electric car and taking people into space. He's out there ahead of the change, trying to take advantage. And then there are other people that try to guide the change and make it for the betterment of society. So maybe it's the way we all respond to change that makes it difficult. But I think change is coming. If you look at things like the project here at Trout Lake, we're part of this ecological reflections network all across the country where artists and scientists are working together. There's a lot of talk about the STEM education in schools. Well, now there's a lot of momentum to change that into STEAM, science, technology, education, art, math. Add the art into that. So I guess my argument is we've always been doing this art and humanities and science collaboration, and it's really the best way for us to address changes in our culture and learn to understand our place on the planet. And at this particular juncture, then, I'm going to do the quotes again, and we'll see how well you did on the review. So, the first quote, it's on the strength of observation and reflection that one finds a way. So we must dig and delve unceasingly. Susan, what did you think the audience sounded like?
It sounded like they said Einstein.
Einstein, it sounded pretty close, but it was Claude Monet. Now, doesn't that sound like a scientist? Observation and reflection? Okay. Number 2, I am like a carnivorous fish swimming between the cold water of art and the warm water of science. You guys got that one on the nail. That was Dolly, yeah, carnivorous fish. And number 3, the most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. Albert Einstein, exactly. So my theory, we're all in pursuit of the same thing, beauty, mystery, and truth.
Well, that was great. I should just cede my time to Terry and let her just carry on because she's so good. So I want to do 3 things, 5 minutes or so each. One is talk about the art of communicating science through writing. The second is why don't people believe science? what's the reasons behind it, and they're manifold. And third, how might we communicate science better? What might be some techniques we could consider using? So the art of writing science, I think, is what we're trying to do is take research data and to place it within a story that talks to both the mind and to the heart. It's this intersection of art and science. It's an education of the mind, it's an education of the heart. It's a recognition that, guess what, we're only half logical. The other half is highly emotional and illogical, as it were. And that should be no surprise. So every belief we have is, of course, colored by our biases, colored by our experiences. All of you walked in tonight, as I did, with a suitcase full of life experience that you pulled behind you. And that life experience filters every last piece of information that comes to you and comes out of you. So in the genre of this communicating of science through writing, it comes in this larger genre called creative nonfiction, which is a terribly creative title, but it's true stories well told. So how can we take scientific data and tell those stories in a way that are more inspiring and are more memorable? A guy that I read a lot of when I was in college was Freeman Tilden. He was a National Park Service interpreter, and he wrote kind of the Bible on interpretation way back in 1957. And he said the specialist's abhorrence of artistic form can empty a room more quickly than a cry of fire. Yeah, and we've all been there, right? And so the king of artistic prose, scientific artistic prose, in my opinion, is Aldo Leopold. And his artistic prose was highly compatible with scientific observation. He had a whole bunch of quotes about the need for science and the humanities and art to intersect. And here's just one of his quotes. He says, "Science in isolation from the humanities, from poetry, music, literature, art, and philosophy, is something barren and even destructive." Leopold's prose legitimized the position that a competent scientist should be sanctioned to write gracefully, to write persuasively. Terry's group, Greenfire, they're having this argument about should scientists just be totally objective and not do anything to persuade people. And I think Leopold took the position that the scientists have an obligation to attempt to persuade while also providing the hard science behind that persuasion. And when you think about writing, juxtapose any piece of scientific writing with something similar that Leopold wrote, and what are you going to remember, right? Which one will stick with you? I think people, when they read science, want revelation. They want something to enchant them. They want wisdom. They want connections. They want inspiration. John Muir said people want beauty as well as bread. And I think that's totally true. So let me give you some examples of Leopold's writing. First, I'll give you some scientific data, and then we'll see how Leopold handled it. So this is from the Silvicultural Handbook for Wisconsin on white pines. And I need my reading glasses. Let's see. Early growth is slow. Open-grown trees are 5 inches in height at age 3, 12 inches at age 5, 4.5 feet after 8 to 10 years. Between 10 and 20 years, growth in open-grown trees can be as much as 4.5 feet per year, but average growth is only 16 inches per year. Got that? That's easy. So Leopold in Sound County Almanac has this to say about pines. Pines have earned the reputation of being evergreen by the same device that governments use to achieve the appearance of perpetuity, overlapping terms of office. Incoming needles take office in June, and outgoing needles write farewell addresses in October. All write the same thing in the same tawny yellow ink, which by November turns brown. Then the needles fall and are filed in the duff to enrich the wisdom of the stand. It is this accumulated wisdom that hushes the footsteps of whoever walks under pines. It's beautiful, isn't it? And something memorable. Let's take the Birds of North America. It's Cornell's online resource, which I subscribe to and use all the time for scientific data. Here's what they say about sandhill cranes and the voice of sandhill cranes. In cranes, the trachea extends, coils, well into the sternum, an anatomical feature that expands the amplitude and alters the pitch of the voice by the addition of harmonies. From a day or so preceding pipping until about 9 to 10 months of age, Young cranes utter a variety of peeps and trilled whistles. The change to the adult voice is preceded by a protracted process of tracheal elongation and intrasternal coiling. It's very romantic. Cranes via Leopold, out of some far recess of the sky, a tinkling of little bells falls softly upon the listening land. Then again, silence. Now comes a baying of some sweet-throated hound, soon the clamor of a responding pack, then a far, clear blast of hunting horns out of the sky and into the fog. High horns, low horns, silence, and finally a pandemonium of trumpets, rattles, croaks, and cries that almost shakes the bog with its nearness, but without yet disclosing whence it comes. At last, a glint of sun reveals the approach of a great echelon of birds. On motionless wing, they emerge from the lifting mist, sweep a final arc of sky, and settle in clangorous, descending spirals to their feeding grounds. A new day has begun on the Crane Marsh. One last one from the Silvicultural Handbook on old-growth forests. Reserved trees are scattered individuals, groups, or patches retained to reach greater ages and larger sizes than the stand matrix. They may be the same species that dominate the main stand, but often are longer-lived associated species. Reserves can be retained in even-aged and uneven-aged stands. Okay, so my attempt at writing creative nonfiction from the introduction of this new book sitting in the truck somewhere in Minocqua. I was leading a group of folks on an old-growth hike, and one of the people said to me, "Why should we care about old trees?" And I stuttered and stammered, and I really had a hard time articulating that. I went home and thought about it and finally wrote up a rather lengthy response, but here's just the first paragraph that I wrote of why we should care. Old-growth forests take histories that are lodged in the imagination and bring them to life. Here, the ancient people, culture, animal, and plant communities are brought down to earth to where our imaginings can gain a foothold. If a 2,500-year-old California redwood was alive that long ago, so it's possible that Alexander the Great once lived, that Christ, that Muhammad, that Socrates all once had flesh and bone, that a Wisconsin hemlock or white pine, now 500 years old, still stands, takes Michelangelo from the shadows, brings Copernicus and Leonardo da Vinci to life, and makes possible whole intact cultures of American Indians. Old growth takes yellowed words on fragile pages and embodies them with real blood seen through green leaves. So that's, I think, hopefully artistically ways of communicating science. Let's talk about why people don't believe science, or the science of science communication. We don't believe science because we have something called motivated reasoning. And motivated reasoning is simply our pre-existing beliefs which color all of our logic. It's that suitcase of life that we pulled in behind us. And we're obviously equal parts emotional and rational beings. And I love this quote: "We think we're being scientists, but really we're being lawyers." And because what we do is we cherry pick facts, right, to back up what we already believe to be true. We want to win our case, guilty, not guilty, climate change, not climate change, and all of that's shot through with biases based on that suitcase of life experience that we're bringing forward. So we have confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is what we heed the evidence that supports our belief, and we have disconfirmation bias, where we debunk or refute arguments that we don't want to believe because it doesn't fit our worldview. So this motivated reasoning, I think, is based on three things. I think it's based on self-interest. Upton Sinclair had a great quote. He said, "It's impossible to make a man understand something if his salary depends on his not understanding it." Right? So self-interest is monetary. But if you replace that salary with words like faith, it's impossible to make a man understand something if his faith depends on his not understanding it. Replace it with traditions. Replace it with politics. Replace it with social standing. Replace it with family. It's impossible to make a man or woman understand something if his politics depends on his not understanding it, right? So our motivated reasoning is based first and foremost probably on self-interest. It's also based on trust. Who do you trust and why? Do you trust Fox News to bring to you science? Do you trust MSNBC? Do you trust Scientific journals, who do you trust? Time magazine? I don't know. Everybody trusts someone differently. What's interesting to me is I don't trust science all the time either. And if you are honest with yourselves, there are times when you do not trust the scientific papers. And I'll give you an example from myself, and I'd like you to think of your own examples of where scientific information says one thing, but you go, I'm not so sure. For me, it's GMOs. Scientific data says, good stuff. Doesn't harm you one bit. Eat it all that you want. It just goes against the whole grain of who I am to combine DNA from different species. It's okay to take DNA of the same species and tweak it and make different varieties of apples, but when we combine different species, that just bothers me. There's something in my internal psyche that says Frankenstein or a whole bunch of other possibilities that we just don't know what we're doing a lot of times. Who knows? So that's an example. Another example for me would be all the chemicals that we put on food. So I eat organically as much as possible, even though the food companies and the chemical companies will tell you, yeah, this is safe for you, don't worry about it. But we all know that different scientific studies come out 5 years later, 10 years later, that refute what came before, right? So science is always a search for truth. It's never the truth with a capital T. It's always provisional. It's always uncertain. And because of that, it makes it very easy for us at whatever time that a scientific study comes up that refutes something we believe to say, that's the moment when I'm not going to believe science. Otherwise, I'm happy to believe all science as long as it supports what I believe already. The third thing is motivated reasoning is based on our social connections. And another quote that I like besides being lawyers is, we're all in high school, we never left high school. So we're high school lawyers, basically, because of this incredible need to fit in. We are social beings. We have, people like us believe this. People like them believe that. This difference in who we believe ourselves to be. So we're very tribal, very, very, very tribal. And for some people, the tribe is way more important than the truth. And for the best scientists, the truth is way more important than the tribe. The bottom line is that people use scientific knowledge to reinforce their beliefs that they already have. So what the hell can we do about it? Pardon my French. So how to communicate science? Well, the method we've been using, and I still buy it to a certain extent, is the deficit model, which is if we just explain the science better and more and endlessly, that people will finally get it. Well, it's not working. Right? It's not working. And in fact, there's a number of cool studies, I don't know how cool they are, but they're interesting, where they took two different groups, they increased their scientific literacy by giving them conflicting scientific evidence, and what they found was that both groups actually dug in deeper. It had a negative effect. It was called the backfire effect. They actually believed what they believed even more despite the new scientific evidence that they were presented with. So it doesn't work very well anyway, the deficit model. I still write all the time about science, and so I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but what we need to do is recognize the emotional aspect of who we are, as well as that rational aspect of who we are. So I went to a conference in Vancouver 13 years ago, sponsored by the Nature Conservancy. I was on their board at that time, and I went to, and I'll be done quick here, I went to two different sessions that really, I still remember vividly. And one, the whole conference was associated with climate change. One of the workshops was run by a guy named D. Alsop. And D. Alsop was Ronald Reagan's media director. He was also a guy who was the media champion for getting us into the first Gulf War, presenting it as evidence. So this guy knows how to change public opinion around. And the title of his talk was Moving from Inconvenient to Personally Compelling. Obviously referring to Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, right? And his core statement, which I found very fascinating, is if we want to move the needle on climate change acceptance and action and other scientific issues, but specifically climate change in this case, start with people and then connect back to the environment. It's the inverse of how all of our science-based Nature Conservancy, in particular communication models, proceeded. The deficit model, no, don't start there, start with people. And what he means by that is present to them what's in it for them. It's a pretty cynical view as far as I'm concerned, but his whole thought was make it real. That's the mantra. And real means what are the tangible personal benefits to each individual person and the consequences, the negative aspects to the particular issue. So he said climate change is not about climate. It has nothing to do with climate. It's nothing to do with stewardship. It's nothing to do with moral responsibility, with reciprocity, with all the things I care about. It all has to do with jobs, with buzzwords, right? Like the economy, with personal safety, with national security, with being independent of foreign oil, with personal health, all the things that we as individuals care in a deeper sense about. And he said what we need to find is the strategic hinge. Everybody has a strategic hinge, which is the link into their personal values, what really matters to them, and their personal code, as it were. And then we'll know how to talk to them. And when we know how to talk to them, we'll be heard, okay? And we're great at persuading by reason, he said, but we're really poor at motivating by emotion. He went on to say something that really disturbed me, but there's some truth to it, just throwing it out there. He says, people don't do something because it's the right thing. They do it because it has personal benefit. And his whole thing was, it doesn't matter what you do if it gets people to do what you want them to do. Wow. So I raised my hand, of course, and I said, you know what we're really trying to do here, besides change the needle, move the needle on climate change, is to have people accept personal responsibility, have them gain a greater environmental ethic, have them accept a higher moral standard for themselves. He said, it doesn't matter. Don't care about that. All that matters is getting people to do what you want them to do. So that was fascinating. The next workshop I went to had 4 religious leaders. And it was called Building Relationships with Faith-Based Communities. And it had a Catholic priest, an Episcopalian minister, a Southern Baptist minister, and a guy from the Christian Coalition. And I'll just tell you about the two of them. The Christian Coalition guy said, I have absolutely no idea why I'm here. He said, I can't believe I'm here with all of you people. He said, I'm a redneck, I'm a gun-toting, and he did the whole stereotype thing. He was from Texas and rah-rah. And he said, this climate change stuff, we don't get any of that, You're not talking to us. The language of our group, he said, is Americans' dependence on foreign oil, on national security. That's the real issue. Talk to us about that in terms of climate. Don't mention climate. For God's sakes, don't say anything about CO2. We don't know what that is. But we get the politics. We get the politics. Talk to us on what we care about. And that they felt like they were being held hostage by oil companies. By not oil companies in the U.S., but oil companies in the Middle East. The second guy that I remember very distinctly is a guy named Gerald Durley, who's a black Baptist minister from Georgia. And he also didn't know why he was there. He was like, I don't know any of you people. And he said, why don't I know all you people? And he says, because you never come and talk to us. And that audience, of course, was all lily white folks like myself, tend to be well-to-do if you belong to the Nature Conservancy and you're in the upper echelons of that group. And he said, so you don't talk to us, so why should we talk to you? And he said, most people have way more competing issues to care about than climate change. He said, why talk to me about polar bears? My people are totally in their face every day. It's hunger and poverty. Hunger and poverty. And you think about, remember Maslow's needs hierarchy. Thank you. Actually, I wrote it down here and I forgot. So you start at the bottom and it's physiological. It's food. Getting through the day. Security is next on the list. Safety of yourself, safety of your property. Then you go up to belonging to a group. So most people are down at that level, and you're at the very top when you finally get to that place of ethics. So the last thing I want to bring up is, first of all, we need to find out how to talk to people where they're at about these issues that matter to us. And then to care about who the messenger is. I love Terry and I love her husband, Jeff Wilson, because they're hunters and trappers and fishermen, but they're also totally involved with endangered species. And what they do, and all kinds of environmental issues, and what they do is bridge that chasm which tends to occur between the hook and bullet crowd and us tree hugger types, right? You guys do a great job at being able to talk to anybody. So the messenger matters. And so you need to take the message, talk to the people about what they care about with someone who they believe. And the classic case for me was being on the Nature Conservancy board for 9 years. And when we had political issues, we didn't send a Democrat from one of our boards to go in and talk to the Republican senator or congressman. We sent a Republican from our board. And it was highly purposeful because the Democrat, first of all, wouldn't have gotten in the door. The Republican went in with the exact same message that the Democrat would have gone in with, but was heard out and often listened to very well, and we often got what we wanted because we sent in the right messenger, someone that would be listening to. So the bottom line is the heart and the emotion, all our values, all our ideologies, our fears, our loves, all that stuff matters every bit as much as our logic, matters every bit as much as the science, and we need to embrace that side of us as much as the science.
So John, when you raised motivational reasoning, I found that really compelling and not something I'd thought much about. And I'm wondering that if there's possibly a misperception or even incomplete perception of it's not so much a lack of belief as it is holding on to a group identity. That, there's possible that some of what is being shared, people believe, but they won't allow themselves to believe it. So.
Right, so a recent study I saw really talks to that very well. And I apologize if I'm using politics in here, I don't mean to do so. But this particular study talked to a group of Republicans who as a whole, don't believe, at least outwardly, in climate change. And so it was the whole group, as a group, and they asked them who believed in climate change. Nobody. Got them then privately into discussion, and 3/4 of them said, I'm really worried about it. I'm really worried about it. So it's that group dynamic. You're not going to do something that will throw you out of your group that you've been in. We're still all in high school. It's the peer group, and it's, it can affect your job, it can affect your credibility, it can affect all kinds of things. Your promotions, if you start going against, the belief system of that particular group you're hanging with. So, yeah.
Thoughts, questions? You said it all, apparently.
Oh,
Do you
it's a scary thought.
here, Mike, please.
Is there inherently more truth in science or art?
Yeah, right,
Yes.
right. I think that question
Former
needs
friend,
further study. Yeah,
Lots of research.
yes.
Are you going to take a shot at that?
I don't even know how to start on that one. It's a great question, though. I mean, I guess I would say that artists are all seeing their own truth. Scientists might have a little more peer review. I'm just like winging it here. I mean, there's peer review on science, but again, as an artist, you get peer reviewed when you put something into a show. But, what are you really seeking there? There's a group dynamic in that show. So, if you're ending a show in northern Wisconsin or in Chicago, it's two totally different things. Whereas for scientists, it might be what journal you're publishing in. I don't think there's an answer
Well,
to that
there is
question.
the scientific method, though. So, there is a process by which we are supposed to prove scientific truth that is repeatable over time. So I think that's different, significantly different than art. But capital T true? No.
Right.
No, it's provisional truth until we find the next study which may divert it.
Can someone throw that guy out?
Yeah. Or at least hit him, slap him. Too philosophical.
So what do you do, because it's very relevant these days with this group dynamic? I mean, I know someone was, not to be political, but Republican, but who's very intelligent and
Right.
has spent time reading about what's going on, and he's a hunter, and how is it, though, that you get the rest of the people? Because as Susan and I were talking about, it's become the liars and the not liars, these days in terms of believing what's true. So what is it that we do? Or what is it that someone like me who goes back to Chicago, where, I try and hang out with tree huggers, but it doesn't always happen.
Well, I think, and I'll talk and then John can respond too, but I think one of the things you look for is points of common interest. I've been thinking about this a lot with regard to an issue that's going on up in Mercer with an ATV trail. And there's the silent sports people who don't want the ATV trail, and there's the business community, much of it, and the ATV club that wants the ATV trail. And I keep thinking this every time they come at this issue, they just turn this into a community shredding process. I said maybe what they need to do is step back and look at what is it that they have in common, and that is an interest in maintaining public land. And figuring out how can we all win out of this. Okay, if you get your ATV trail, maybe we get a silent sports trail. And I think with climate change, you can look for things that we all care about and try and steer away from those things that are the most disparate. So look at what is it that we care about. Fuel economy in the climate change. We all want to spend less money in gasoline. The ability of our country to have more solar power, more energy diversity, jobs from solar power, jobs from coal plants, whatever. I think we have to pick those battles so that we can start to talk across those gaps. And once you start talking, then you get to know that person and they realize that you're not what they thought you were.
Yeah, people are really complicated, and I think we have to recognize that you can have people that don't believe in climate change, which to me is crazy thinking, because these are our kids and grandkids. We're seeing it right now, but we won't see the worst of it by any means. But these same people who don't believe in that are doing all kinds of great work other places oftentimes, and so we have to find the common ground of where we do things that we care about. And I think the one item that we all have in common in the Northwoods is we love this place. No matter our political beliefs, we all love this place. We sure as hell didn't come here to make a lot of money, I don't think. If you did, you were a little bit on the insane side of the coin. Most people came here out of love of this place. So we can start there. But I think it's a long-term process. We need to talk to one another. I think back to when all the marching was taking place against Act 10 in Madison, and I was at a meeting in Madison at the time of those marches, and milling about with some folks at a Nature Conservancy meeting, and this one wonderful woman, a very liberal, very heartfelt, sensitive woman, was just so angry at those union people out there. And it just didn't fit. And I said, why? Well, she said, I was a teacher. And then I really said, why? You should be caring about this. And she said, well, what I saw was the union always protecting the lousy teachers, and it just made me so mad. It made me so mad that the union protected them. And what I did was listen. And I spent a half hour listening to her, and then we slowly talked about this, and by the end of the conversation, it took an hour, but I found out what was truly disturbing her. And she felt validated for that, and it was rational to say what she said. I didn't get the same conclusion that unions are therefore bad and that we need to eliminate them. But we have to engage in these long-term conversations. To ask someone to change that suitcase of beliefs they're coming in the door with because you cite some scientific study, it's nonsense. No one's gonna say, well, by God, you're right. I've been wrong all my life. Thanks very much. I'm a changed man. It's just not going to happen. So we have to engage. I mean, we have to take time to talk to people at length. And it's such a slow process, and it's disheartening because you have to work through a lot of stuff. And you may never get there. There may be people that are just so motivated in their faith, in their politics, whatever it may be, that they're unmovable. I had a cousin that was unmovable, very bright guy. I couldn't imagine why he had this politics the way he had them, but there wasn't anything you could say that made any difference. So sometimes you just have to give up, too. Sad to say. Sorry.
Here. Can you describe some of the art that you had in your Paradise Lost, and what were some of the comments that you had from the people that attended the art show?
Well, Paradise Lost had everything from watercolors and photography to oil paintings, sculptures. One of the things we had was a big sculpture of a puzzle that was a puzzle of the United States with like toy cars pulling states south. That was based on a Union for Concerned Scientists chart of what the climate in Wisconsin would be like when it was, more like Missouri. We had a lot of people make comments, I think mostly on the artwork that they could relate to. There was one really big watercolor painting, like maybe almost as big as that, as tall as that wall behind me, maybe 5 or 6 feet tall and 4 or 5 feet wide. And the artist had painted the ice on Lake Superior with all its myriad chunks going off in different directions. And in each chunk, she had painted in the shadows of species that would be impacted by climate change. Her name is Helen Klebesattel. She's out of Madison. And people really liked that because it was sort of like a Where's Waldo? But it gave them a chance to look for something that they cared about. And I think it was interesting, too. We had fiber art in there, and people who were into sewing would go immediately to the fiber art. I remember a piece that was in one of our Drawing Water show, which was a quilt of all sorts of lake data. And there was a U.S. Geological Survey scientist who came up and was looking at that quilt for many, many minutes. And I said, what's going on here? And he said, this is my whole career here. And he went and pointed to each study he'd worked on that had been built into her quilt. So really cool. But then you'd get quilters that would come in who would just love that piece. So I think people found things that they related to individually, and that was what they would gravitate towards.
Another question here, Mike?
So you talk about the need to better communicate science to the public. I've worked in science my entire career, and I'm friends with you both, and you're artists, and I appreciate art, and I use one part of my brain to appreciate that, but I also know that I cannot inject the same emotional part of my brain into my scientific work because that creates bias. Art is designed to generate emotional response, positive, negative, pleasant, or not. Science is, like you say, the pursuit of information that we hope is correct. And I guess I in my career, have always struggled with the need for scientists to better communicate their work to the public, but the prohibition of us using some of the tools that you folks use in conducting our work. So I don't know if this is coming across clearly, but there's a difference in how we talk about the same subjects. And as you read the different quotes from Aldo versus the technical manuals, I love Aldo, I love the technical manuals, but you can't blend the two in science. So the big problem is taking the raw, dry information that has to be dispassionately generated without bias or emotion, and then finding the tools to convince an audience that what they're hearing is true, that hasn't been interjected with emotion or bias. And unfortunately, in the scientific discussion today, there's a disinformation machine that is much larger and well-funded than the information machine. And that's where we've gone off the rails, especially with climate. In the 80s and 90s, the Republicans and Democrats were singing out of the same hymnal. They were listening to the scientists. Along came the disinformation campaign from the fossil fuel industry, and here we are today. Everybody is in their camps. So I don't have an answer, but I do know that, as John mentioned in Greenfire, which I'm a member of, we're having a discussion about how scientists should present their work. Where's the line between advocacy and information? And we, as a group, don't agree as to where that line lies. So some of the problem is always going to be scientists communicating to the people that want to communicate the results. And I guess it's an interesting tension. I kind of went off on a different track here, but It's,
No.
no, it's important for the scientific language and the scientific process to be discussed in context with what you folks are discussing. Okay, I have my say.
Well, I think that is a totally spot-on comment. And I think what we have to look at is what is the audience that the message is being targeted to. The technical papers are never going to be read by the general public necessarily. So I think there's two things. There's good science communication where you can take that technical information and put it down to an understandable sentence that the general public can use. It could go out in a press release or a magazine article or on a television show, which still would be kind of reducing the scientific level of that information, but would still hopefully reflect that science. So that would be one way, is just having scientists communicate more clearly and succinctly the upshot, as Aldo Leopold put it, of their work, I think. The other thing would be to look to partners to tackle the emotional elements. So once you've got someone sucked into a painting, then they might be interested in hearing a little more about the science because you've touched something inside of them. And certainly not to take the scientists and turn them into the artist or have them go all wishy-washy on emotions.
So one final point. So what you need to pressure scientists or promote from scientists is plain language. And that's what I've always tried to bring to my work so that I can communicate scientific products to a general audience. So that's where, don't make them artists, but make them speak plainly in a
Right.
language that you can then take and communicate it more broadly.
And maybe that, so the comment, the comment was that what maybe needs to happen is the scientists need to be speaking more clearly and plainly and succinctly to the public, and maybe that's a role for the universities. And I think I've noticed actually a trend in a lot of science writing towards less jargon than it used to have. But I think it's something that has to be fought against. And maybe you have some comments, John, on this point.
I agree, you're spot on. Scientists risk reputations if they are seen as not objective. And that's always been the conundrum for a scientist, right? But Mike, when you give a talk, inherent in your talk is passion and love. It's all in there. I can feel it every time. I hear it every time. And conservation of loons or whatever you're working with, it is clear that that's why you're there. So that's coming through. I wonder about, for Green Fire, for instance, if there isn't a division of labor where the group who really wants to just present the facts, Jack, and be unquestionably objective can do so, but then there's another group who will take those facts then and say, given those facts, here's the what we believe to be the appropriate response from a policy standpoint, from an individual standpoint. What should we do? Science is over so many of our heads, that we look. I have a master's degree in science, but I don't have a clue what a whole lot of the scientific journals are saying. I mean, they're so jargon-esque, so full of technical information. How do we bring it down to earth, and how do we, you look to your doctor to tell you, okay, here's what all those tests say, now what should I do? You look for advice and counsel. And I think scientists need to step up to the plate, some of them in some manner or another, and say, here's what we need to do. Here's what the science is telling us. But I understand you're risking credibility and risking professional position sometimes.
Can I talk?
Oh, yes, we have a question back here.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
I'm getting a little impatient with, in general, the intellectualization of this conversation. Am I on? I guess I am. We're talking in intellectual kinds of ways about something that did come up earlier, and that's the tribalization that's happening in this country. It's dangerous. It is happening on the stage of the when all of these fellows were lined up for the presidential debates on the other, what I would call the other side. And again, I think that you made the point, John, that people in a group will still say, no, there's no climate change, but when they're talked to individually, they're hedging, they're a little bit concerned. But the peer pressure, the money, the power behind the dumbing down of America is very real, and I want to have this conversation about how do I talk to my neighbors, my friends who will still say, but there's always been cold times, there's always been hot times, it's just normal. And they're hearing it in their churches and on television. It's a serious problem, and how do we not talk about it in terms of, I mean, what we're talking about here is very, very good, and blending art and what you're doing, but how do we talk about it in a way that we can combat? I don't have an answer, but that's what I am looking for, is that conversation. Thank you.
I don't think I have an answer on how we bridge this gap. I think the gap has gotten really huge in the last few years between groups that are talking to each other. I know that one thing is that we have to have social interactions with people and learn to trust each other before anybody's going to listen to what anybody else says. So part of the problem I see where I live in my little community is that the people don't end up in the same social places, they don't get to know each other, so they never even have a chance to talk about anything. And I think the first step we could all take is make friends with our neighbors and have coffee with them and, you know, visit and start to introduce these topics in a non-threatening environment. I don't have a silver bullet on how we do it. I don't think, you know, you could go online and look at various suggestions from websites on how to communicate science better. I think scientists are looking for those tools. One of the people that I've been working with recently is writing a whole paper on science advocacy and what does that mean today. And the paper looks at how you can write scientifically without putting a lot of value-laden language in it so that someone who's reading it who might not agree with you doesn't immediately get turned off because you haven't used language that's inflammatory. So I don't know that I have an answer.
There is a book called Democracy and Change, and Dr. Nancy McLean wrote it, and it is very well detailed how from the approximately the 50s, the whole process has become something that the Koch brothers in particular, the money of dumbing of America, it's a direct line for that kind of conclusion, and for the kind of conclusion that they are seeking, which is, no, there's no climate change, we're going to have our corporations in charge, and it's a serious issue. And those communications coming at us from the internet and from the world's, from our stage in the United States, the White House and so forth, we really have a corner to turn if we can turn it. So that's what you can see I'm pretty concerned. And we're all concerned, I know we are, yeah.
Yeah, I certainly get your frustration. We feel it in spades, and we don't have any answers either. One of the things when someone says they don't believe in climate change, I say, well, if the scientists all said that it was, after all, we were wrong, that climate change really isn't true, would you believe the scientists then? Oh yeah, I would. And so then I go back and say, okay, well, how did you get to this place where you have the conclusion it doesn't exist? And try to talk in a non-confrontational way where we're just getting angry. How do you just bring it down and say, tell me your story. How did that come to be for you? That, from my standpoint, 97% of the scientists, is actually more than that, say that climate change is absolutely real, but you're believing the 2%. Would you, why? Tell me how you got there. those are long-term conversations, but what you're talking about is this larger political stage as well, and how do we move the politics, and we keep doing the science, we have to keep talking, we have to keep bringing the data forward, but we have to learn to listen to one another, and then engage quietly over time and hope for the best. That's terrible, but.
Yeah, I think, your message has been, that I'm hearing and knowing you guys, that there's no one single way of doing it and making this happen. It's not going to happen very quickly. It's going to take time and various methods. And I guess, the question is, how do you get it across? I look at the Mindy's painting there, and I know Mindy, and I know, but and I looked at that and I saw a nice painting, but until Terry, you explained exactly what it was, and I'm just wondering, when you had that on display, what explanation was there, or were people just left to try and interpret it? Because that's maybe one of the things that could be done. How did you was there explained?
When we had the exhibit, I have to say we need to get a little better. We have these on display at Trout Lake now, and we have to get labels on the walls. But we had scientific information that went along with the pieces, charts and graphs and information in a very readable way that went along and helped people think about the artwork and then read the science, and then maybe they'd go back and reassess the artwork again. So I think that's important. And I think the other thing is, when you think about when I was looking at this talk, and I was thinking about when have we had change in our country and when did we have cultural shifts, and I was thinking, when I mentioned the picture of the Cuyahoga River on fire and the book Silent Spring, it could be that we're just not at the critical mass yet for people to take that next scientific leap. We have a lot of challenges ahead of us with world population and sustainability, and it's not just climate change, it's all sorts of scientific things that we have to come to grips with as our population changes on the planet and demographics shift in countries. So it might just be that we're not yet at that critical point where something's going to be the catalyst that takes us to that next leap. And one of the things that my husband always wants me to talk about is, what is it that the scientists have really made a difference? And if you think back, that's not to say that scientists who are bad communicators, whatever that might be, don't make a difference, but the ones that we think of, the Aldo Leopolds, the Henry David Thoreau, well, he wasn't really a scientist, but people like Jacques Cousteau, who did the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau, which the older folks here would know about, filmmakers, Jane Goodall, filmmaking, they use communication tools to get their science across. So I think we need to think about developing those images, that critical mass of information, and the right timing at the right place at the right time with maybe an event will be the catalyst that will push us to that next stage. The Industrial Revolution didn't happen overnight. The Enlightenment didn't happen overnight. Everything takes time.
Terry and I had talked a bit about tipping points. We're having the tipping point with the Me Too movement, right? That had been going on forever. Why now was that a tipping point? What happened? And I have no clue, but it happened. And I wonder, how do we find these tipping points on various issues like climate change? The U.S. is so far behind every other country, developed country in the world. You had that chart that Terry gave a talk last night in Mercer and showed a chart of all the European countries and other Asian countries, and they're all in. They're all in on it. We're the ones. We're the only country that's not buying. Why? Where's our tipping point going to come from? I just don't know. And these seems almost magical when they occur, that suddenly the momentum is there.
That whole 99th monkey, you have to get to a certain number. And it gets back to social interactions.
We have a question online with Susan.
Terry kind of answered this already, but are there other scientific topics besides climate change that could be connected by art and science?
Well, yes, for sure. I think lots and lots. In fact, if you look at that, if you do a Google search on science art collaborations, you're going to find everything from genetics to who knows what, lots of different science where artists are engaged with that. At Trout Lake, we're not just looking at climate change, we're looking at lake ecology, change over time, all sorts of things that the artist can interpret. The LTER network that's working in ecological systems around the country has research sites that are everything from the tundra to coral reefs to Antarctica, where there's art being done along with that science. And some of it is on climate change, but also on other topics. So I think, the sky's the limit. And I think artists are really looking for exciting, interesting things to focus their work on. And I think scientists are actually pretty open to getting communication tools, even if they just put a piece of art in a PowerPoint that's largely technical. It gives them something to help connect to the audience.
Question back here.
I was always under the impression that the truth eventually prevails. I'm sure back in the day, there was a big argument over whether the earth was flat or round, but folks eventually figured it out. But I do remember the wars and the science and court battles over whether cigarettes kill you or not. And we all kind of know now, but there was a lot of false science and a lot of corruption before that was decided. My fear now, though, is with the two issues, climate change and nuclear holocaust, do we as Homo sapiens have enough brain matter to figure this out in time? I kind of am not sure about that.
That's my husband. That's like, morning coffee conversation. Yeah, so you
Nuclear
get to answer that
holocaust,
one.
yeah.
We've had this conversation.
We know cigarettes kill, but a lot of people still smoke.
Right.
Yeah. Well, isn't that the question for humanity over the ages? Are we really as smart as we think we are? Are we going to adapt? At some point, the species will go extinct. Is it now? Is it 100 years from now? Or is it 100,000 years from now? I personally think this is the big challenge for us. Are we going to adapt to this new change in our situation? Are we able to think that far ahead? Can we think ahead generationally? Or are we always going to look at short-term gain? And I think that's why we're having all this angst about it, because it's not easy to do. And we're not used to thinking long-term. So it's a challenge. And the fact that you're all here is indicative that we are rising to the challenge. And we just have to encourage everybody to rise up to the challenge.
Another question back here.
So my question comes more as a millennial, where I've heard conversations about climate change revolve around, well, I'm not going to see it, so why would I worry about it? And personally, I take that very personal, considering that I might see it myself, or if I decide to have children, my children might see that. So to kind of end it more on a positive note, what kind of encouragement or advice would you give to younger generations who are dealing with this as their truth and their future? Because I've seen a lot of pessimism among my fellow peers and a lot of distrust and fear, and I'd like to be able to offer some words of encouragement as well.
Well, I think it's important to spin some positive stuff here, and I don't think it's a spin. If we think back to when we were 20 years old, that's not early 1970s for me anyway. I was raised in Pennsylvania. It was totally polluted. I mean, we wouldn't dream of swimming in the Allegheny or Monongahela River, Ohio River. It was just a brown mess. You'd go through the tunnels in Pittsburgh and you'd asphyxiate, if I can say that. And so we've come a huge long way. There's so many things that are out there now, knowledge, scientific understanding, ethical discussions that weren't occurring when we were your age. So I think in so many ways, we are so far ahead of where we were. We were just doing women's rights. We were just doing civil rights. We were just doing, finally, EPA and endangered species. We were just finally figuring that stuff out and trying to make a difference. And I think we've come a huge long way. We're in a bit of a down cycle, shall we say, to leave it at that. But there's a pendulum, and I think the pendulum will come back. The problem I see is we're a crisis-oriented species. We all are individually. You know, you're not going to do anything about your septic system until it floods your bathtub. You know, you're not going to worry about it until it's right in your face, kind of thing. And I think that's the problem with climate change. It's so slow-moving. It's the invisible present that so many scientists have talked about. How do you make the invisible present for all of us right now, right here, so that we get it and we do something about it? But overall, I'd suggest to you that we're miles and miles ahead of where we were a few decades ago. We just have to, our heart has to open more so than what it has.
You know, I think for millennials, you have a really powerful voice. And I think what you need to do is get out there and tell the older generation that it's time that they started paying attention to these things. I think, you know, this book was really hard to read. Was really, talk about bad technical writing. But one of the things she talked about was the apathy and denial and how, you know, you guys are faced with this potential collapse of all the things that you know and love on the planet. And so it's pretty easy to think, well, there's nothing I can do, or it's hopeless. And she is arguing that we have to get past that grieving stage to move ahead. And so what I think you need to do is encourage each other to get out there, talk to your elders, look what's happening with the the school shooting situation. And a few young people get involved and people start paying attention. That's their kids and their grandkids. It's just like when kids or grandkids tell their parents not to smoke, they start listening a little more. So I think you have a lot of power there. You just need to mobilize that power and push us out of the way. We've been there. You know, we need to go off and sit on our porches or something. Retire, and you guys can take charge and fix it and ask us for our help. Make us help out too, because it's a big job to fix.
I'm about to violate the major rule of Q&A, and that's make sure your questions are questions. I think there's a question in here somewhere. So going back to this concept of where do we find a tipping point in consciousness, right? And awareness, whatever you want to call it. I think the issue we've been dancing around is the concept of frames, right? I don't mean rhetorical frames, which is how our brains work, right? How we, through rationality and emotion, sort of create these physical, in our brains, ways of understanding phenomena, words, relationships, all of that. And they're very pesky, persistent things. But I find encouragement in this sort of tipping point concept and how this sort of disinformation machine, as we've been calling it, has morphed its own framing as the science around climate change, for instance, has gotten better, right? The data's gotten more persuasive. I remember 15 years ago, the main sort of framing within that disinformation machine was climate change isn't happening, right? It's not going on. Then as the data becomes better, the strategy shifts to, well, of course it's happening, but it's always happened, right? And so on and so on. And now we're entering a new age where they're even willing to admit that humans are causing this, but what are you going to do about it? It's a cost-benefit analysis type of question. We're better off mitigating, right, this sort of inevitable future we have at our stake. So I find that I see that as both proof that changing these sort of persistent, pesky frames is possible, right? But it's also grounds for pessimism, right? This disinformation campaign is very because it has one goal in mind, it can just pivot to the next sort of rationale behind it. I guess a question in that is, where can the arts sort of help change consciousness along those same lines in ways that PR firms and lobbying firms have been so effective at it at a sort of cultural level?
Well, I think repetition is really important. You know, the more times the message gets out there, I can't remember the statistics on how many times you have to hear something before you'll remember it or think that it's true. And my husband's giving me hand signals 7 times. 7 times. Anyway, you know, if we're repeating this message and we're seeing it out there from many different angles, you know, the more times it's there, the more people will start saying, well, maybe there is something to this because, look, I've seen this in so many different places and they weren't all coming from the same source. So I think that might be a helpful thing. And I think we also need to think about the scale of time we're talking about here. We're used to things happening pretty fast. And I know we're racing against time with climate change, but we also have to think about in the sense of the millenniums. You know, how many years has it really been since this got really critical? 20 years? You know, we're moving, and we need to move fast, but maybe we're also feeling a lot of anxiety because we're used to immediate results, and maybe if this happens a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, you know, the sooner the better, but maybe it still will happen, and we'll end up with a better result.
So your question was about the arts in particular. And I think one thing we're doing poorly is we're talking to the choir all the time. If we have an art opening, who comes to the art opening? The same old people who always come to the art openings. How do we change who we're talking to? One of the things we did in the Drawing Water exhibit, which I have no idea if it works, but that I was happiest about is that we put up the signage at the boat landings, which has some of Terry's paintings and other artwork and some of my poems and some scientific data, so that everybody, not just whoever's going to come to the art opening, is going to see these displays. So we're trying to reach out and get beyond the discussion just with the choir. I'd love to know whether it matters 1 iota to anybody putting in their boat there. I don't know. But that's, I think, what we need to do artistically is find ways to do that. The first thing that comes to mind is the duck stamp. That is an artistic endeavor that duck hunters love. Okay, so is there some way to tweak and play with that? Here's something that's accepted in the hunting community, which isn't, I'm going to stereotype like crazy here, I apologize, but isn't typically considered the artistic community. Oh God, I'm in trouble, probably big time now. But you know what I'm trying to say? You're trying to reach across some stereotypical gaps between who you're talking to. So anyway, that's one potential avenue that might be explored for it. Don't know, frankly, but I worry about, we're just talking to ourselves an awful lot. I do worry about that.
One more here. Oh, that's there.
So one tool artists used in the 60s when we were young and wanted to change things was to use art to illustrate hypocrisy and deceit. Maybe artists need to get a little more hard-edged about their topics.
Bam.
No, seriously. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, artistically projecting information is great, and you know that illustration is wonderful. But you know what changed things in the '60s was young people using art forms like song and poetry and street theater to demonstrate hypocrisy and deceit of their elders. And maybe that's where this has to go, if you want to see effective social change.
Well, and it needs to get online, too. It needs to get out there in the world of, and that's where we need the millennials, because, like, I've never tweeted. And, you know, we need this stuff to be Snapchatting and, you know, traveling in other ways. But I think that's true.
One more question here.
I can tweet my notes later if that helps.
Okay.
So, Terry, when you started, you talked about how really both science and art are pursuing truth and mystery, which for me are names of God. And we're living in an increasingly secularized world. I think part of the tribalism has to do with sort of that, a backlash and a resistance to the secularization and the fact that the nuns and the spiritual but non-religious are overtaking the Christians in the United States. So how could science and art help people to reverence the truth and reverence the mystery in the way that religion used to?
Well, I think actually it gets back to getting outside of your normal social circle. So I know actually there are websites that I've gone and looked at. I have a couple really good friends who are very evangelical Christian, and we do art together. And we have great conversations about these kinds of things. And she's shown me some of the websites, one friend in particular, where it's Christian artists making work that relates to the environment. And I think we need to step outside our normal social circle and reach out to those groups and say, let's look for things that we have in common. We may not agree on all parts of dogma or doctrine, but what do we have that we could work on together? And stop worrying about so much stop looking at what separates us and look for what brings us together. And recognize that in the science, none of the scientists that are out there studying these things are doing it just because they like numbers. It's not because they like doing data analysis or plugging in sets of numbers into computers. It's because they care about whatever it is they're studying, whether it's a small little thing under a microscope or a old-growth ecosystem. They're doing it because they're intrigued by that place, and it's the same kind of feelings that people would have no matter what their faith are for something they have reverence in.
I've got a great quote for whatever it's worth, because we probably have to end at
wonderful
some
way to
point.
end it, yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm sure people want to get out of here at some point.
They're getting thirsty.
Chet Ramo is an author I've read a lot, a physicist, now passed away out of Massachusetts. He wrote a beautiful book called Natural Prayers. And he's not particularly religious, but he's very spiritual, okay? And he says, knowledge is an island in a sea of mystery. We are at our best as creatures of the shore, with one foot on the hard ground of fact and one foot in the sea of mystery. It is at the shore that the creative work of the mind is done, the work of the artist, the poet, the philosopher, and scientist.